In today's video, we're going to work on this 2016 Mercedes GLE 350 4Matic, changing out the alternator. We'll do our best to give you a full overview of what's required as far as tools, as well as the things that you'll need to do to change the alternator. First things first, go ahead and take the engine cover off and set it aside. Next, you'll go to the passenger side door and move the chair forward all the way. Underneath the passenger's side chair, you'll find the access port where the battery sits. Notice the battery terminal here. To undo it, take a 12mm socket on the end of a wrench. You'll go ahead and ratchet it out. But before you do that, make sure you grab a pair of gloves so that you don't get zapped by the battery. Once the terminal is detached from the battery, you're going to try and find a way to keep it from making contact with the battery. It's very important because you don't want to get zapped while you're changing out the alternator. As you can see here, we wrapped the wire in a towel to keep it from making contact with the battery. But if it doesn't feel like this is going to hold, find another way to keep those two separate. Next, you'll go to the front of the car and take a quick picture of the serpentine belt. You'll use this picture later when you put the serpentine belt back on. But speaking of the serpentine belt, to get it off, you'll take a 17mm deep socket on the end of a breaker bar or torque wrench. You'll use that breaker bar to loosen the tensioner and be able to pull the serpentine belt off. Now, to get the serpentine belt out of the car, we're going to take out the hose that feeds the air into the engine. You're going to want 2 flathead screwdrivers for this. It takes a little bit of effort to get it out, mostly because it has these difficult tabs. 2 on the bottom, which you use that flathead screwdriver to pry off, and then a few on the top. Now that that tube's removed, we can take out our serpentine belt, put it in a clean, safe space. Next, we'll take our newly refurbished alternator out of the box. On the top, that's where the live wire attaches to the alternator, and this little space is where a small wire attaches into the alternator. Looking ahead, this is that small wire that you want to be careful about. But in the present, we still have the old alternator in here. This is the live wire, and it's attached by 2 brackets. To undo those brackets, just take a flathead screwdriver and lift up that metal piece. You should be able to slip out that wire to give you a little bit more space to work and eventually remove the live wire from the alternator. Once the live wire is loose, there's a black cap covering the nut that holds the live wire to the alternator. To remove that cap, just take a flathead screwdriver and pry it open. Then you'll take a wrench with a bolt to remove it from the alternator. Looking ahead again, this is where that live wire attaches to the alternator. This is without the alternator in the bay. To remove the alternator, you'll need a Torx or star-shaped socket set, as well as an articulating wrench. So here we have the 12mm socket on the wrench. And here are those 4 bolts on the alternator. 2 up top, and then 2 down below. They are fairly long bolts and they take a little while to take out, so just be aware of that. What we did in order to preserve the small wire in the back of the alternator was remove 1, 2, and 3 on your screen of those bolts, and then loosen number 4. That allowed us to roll the alternator forward so that we could see it, and then remove that small blue plug. So here's our new alternator with the port for the small blue plug. In order to get it off, you need to lift up a small gray tab so that it loosens and you're able to pull it straight out. Once the small wire is unplugged, you can loosen that final bolt and take out the old alternator. Here's the small wire once again. Make sure to note how the old alternator was mounted in the body of the car. Then take your new alternator, and before you install it, go ahead and loosen that bolt that will hold the live wire to the alternator. And set that bolt aside in a place you can find it. Now we do the process in reverse. Go ahead and mount that bottom 4 bolt into the new alternator. That way you can access the wire and plug it into the back of the alternator. Then you can roll the alternator back into place and mount those other 3 bolts. Tighten them all gradually and together, that way the alternator mounts in its bay correctly. Now that the new alternator is in, we can go ahead and attach the live to the side of the alternator and bolt it back on. Don't forget that black cap. Once your wires are attached, the alternator is in place and you've reattached the live to its 2 clips. Go ahead and pull up the picture of the serpentine belt that you took earlier. You're going to use that as a guide of how to reinstall the serpentine belt. Once it's snugly on all the wheels except for the tensioner, you'll take your breaker bar with your 17mm deep socket and then loosen that tensioner so that you can slip the serpentine belt over. Looking back at our reference photo, that's the bolt that you need to use the breaker bar with the 17mm deep socket on in order to loosen the tensioner. Once the serpentine belt is remounted, you'll go back to the cabin of the vehicle and remount that wire that was attached to the battery terminal back to the battery terminal. Once again, gloves are a good idea so that you don't get zapped. Once the battery terminal is attached, you can close up that protective cover and go ahead and exit the cabin. Now, a bad alternator may have affected the condition of your battery, so it might be a good time to change your battery or simply to charge it. If you do wind up using one of these trickle charges, attach it to the battery terminal first and then to the wall. Once the battery's finished charging, we'll go ahead and fire it up, make sure everything's looking great. And then that'll be the end of changing the alternator. In any case, I hope this helps you as you change your own alternator, and I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give it a big thumbs up, and if you haven't done so already, subscribe down below, and I will see you in the next video. Totally.